For nearly 1,000 years, one fortress has collected more secrets, more screams and more souls than any other building in English history. Kings have entered through its gates. Queens have knelt before its executioners. Children have vanished into its shadows, never to be seen again. The Tower of London has watched it all. And tonight, we're going to walk through those ancient stones together, from the very first foundation laid in blood, all the way to the ravens who guard it still. Here's what really happened behind those walls. If you enjoy these history stories, a like or subscribe is always nice. Drop your city in the comments too. Love seeing where everyone's listening from tonight, so get comfortable. Seriously, fix your pillows, pull up that blanket. Because we're going back almost 1,000 years to a time when England wasn't even England yet. Not really. It was about to become something else entirely. And it all started with a battle, a conqueror, and a fortress designed to terrify everyone who saw it. Picture London in 1066. October, specifically. The air is cold and smells like smoke and old fish. The city isn't pretty. It's cramped, muddy, full of wooden houses packed together so tight that when one catches fire, half the neighbourhood goes with it. The people here speak English. They worship in English churches. Their kings have English names. And then comes William. William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, just killed their king at Hastings. Harold Godwinson took an arrow to the face, and now everything these Londoners know is about to change. William's army is marching toward the city, and nobody knows what's going to happen next. Well, William knew. He didn't just want to conquer England, he wanted to break it, to make sure these stubborn island people never forgot who was in charge now. And the best way to do that, build something so massive, so terrifying, that every time they looked up at the sky, they'd see Norman stone looking back down at them. Within weeks of taking the crown, William ordered construction to begin. Right there, at the southeast corner of London's old Roman walls, overlooking the River Thames. The spot was perfect, strategic. You could see anyone coming from miles away, and more importantly, everyone in London could see the fortress going up, stone by stone, day after day. A Norman chronicler at the time wrote that William's men built fortifications against the restlessness of the huge and brutal populace. Yeah, the locals weren't happy about being conquered. Shocking, right? And William didn't even speak English. Can you imagine? Your new king shows up and you can't understand a word he's saying. Just points at things and yells in French. The first structure was wooden. Most early medieval fortresses were. Hollywood likes to show you stone castles everywhere, but in 1066 wood was faster. You could throw up a wooden palisade in weeks. Stone took years, decades even. But William wanted stone. He wanted permanence. He wanted his statement carved into the London skyline forever. Around 1078, construction began on what would become the White Tower, the great square keep at the heart of everything. And let me tell you about this building. The White Tower rose 90 feet into the air. Its walls were 15 feet thick in places. 15 feet! You could fit a small apartment inside those walls. The English labourers forced to build it must have looked at the blueprints and just despaired. Because not only were they building the instrument of their own oppression, they were building it for a foreign king who just killed everyone they loved at Hastings. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is basically a medieval English history book written by monks, complains that King William sorely burdened the unhappy people with forced labour on castles. They don't go into detail about how he motivated them, But use your imagination. It wasn't with pizza parties and positive reinforcement. The stone came from Caen in France. Bright white limestone that glowed in the sun. That's where the name comes from. The White Tower. When it was finished, that pale stone must have looked almost ghostly against London's grey sky. Like a giant ghost had settled itself right in the middle of the city and refused to leave. Inside, the White Tower had two purposes that existed in constant tension with each other. Upstairs there were sumptuous chambers for the king, tapestries, fireplaces, a private chapel, all the comforts a medieval monarch could want, and below? They left that space open for something else entirely, the dungeons. From the very beginning, the tower was designed to hold prisoners. It wasn't an afterthought. It was the whole point. A royal stronghold and a prison, all in one convenient package. William died in 1087, but his legacy kept growing. His son, William Rufus, reinforced the tower with stone curtain walls, replacing those early wooden palisades. More towers went up, more walls. By the time Edward then got done with it in the late 1200s, the tower had become a concentric fortress. Multiple layers of walls, a deep moat fed by the Thames, and numerous intimidating towers bristling with arrow slits and murder holes. Each tower had a name: the Bloody Tower, the Salt Tower, the Bell Tower, the Wakefield Tower, names that would become synonymous with suffering over the centuries to come. Imagine standing inside those walls back then. The smell of horses and smoke and unwashed bodies packed together. The constant noise of construction, hammering and shouting in French and English and whatever other languages the workers spoke. The clank of armour as soldiers patrolled the battlements. And underneath it all, the ever-present sound of the Thames, that dark ribbon of water that connected London to the sea and brought ships from all over the known world. The tower wasn't just a fortress, it was a small city unto itself. Blacksmiths working, their forges, cooks preparing meals for hundreds of people, servants scurrying through corridors, priests saying mass in the chapel, and always, always, the prisoners, locked away in their cells, scratching the days into stone walls, waiting to learn their fate. Kings poured money into this place. Henry III, Edward I. They knew something important. Whoever held the tower held London, and whoever held London held England. It was that simple. Now. Here's where we meet our first real character, and honestly he's kind of my favourite, because of the sheer audacity of what he pulled off. Ranulph Flambard. Picture a tall, portly man with clever eyes and an easy smile. Flambard was the Bishop of Durham, which sounds religious, but in 1100, being a bishop was mostly a business arrangement. He was really a royal administrator, a tax collector with a fancy hat. And here's the irony that makes this story perfect. Flambard had actually helped design parts of the White Tower. He knew its layout, its weaknesses, every nook and shadow. So when the new king, Henry III, accused Flambard of extortion and threw him in the tower, you'd think the man would know there was no escape. He'd built the prison himself. He knew how secure it was, but Flambard wasn't done yet. See, the thing about being a wealthy prisoner in medieval England is that you could still live pretty well. Flambard kept his servants. He could order in food. He had an allowance. It was more like house arrest for rich people than actual imprisonment. And Flambard used every advantage he had. One evening, he hosted a feast for his guards. A real party. The best wines money could buy. Roasted meats, music, laughter. The guards had been watching Flambard for months and nothing interesting ever happened. just a fat bishop eating and complaining. So they relaxed, they drank, they got drunk. And while they were drinking wine, Flambard's friends had smuggled something into the tower. Hidden inside a wine cask was a rope. That night, after the guards had passed out in a stupor of French wine, Flambard made his move. He tied the rope to something solid near his window, high up in the white tower. He looked down at the ground, maybe 90 feet below, and then this portly, middle-aged bishop climbed out the window and lowered himself down into the darkness. Associates were waiting below with horses. By the time the guards woke up the next morning, heads pounding, mouths tasting like something had died in them, Flambard was gone, vanished into the night like a ghost. He fled to Normandy, where he became chief advisor to Duke Robert, William the Conqueror's other son. He even led an army to try to invade England. It didn't work out, but still. The man escaped the most secure fortress in England and then tried to come back and conquer the place. You have to respect that. The escape was so audacious that one chronicler genuinely suggested Flambard must have used witchcraft. Because how else could anyone escape the Tower of London? It had to be magic. It wasn't magic. It was wine, a rope, and knowing exactly how the system worked from the inside. Flambard eventually reconciled with King Henry IV, got his old job back in Durham, lived to a ripe old age, died in bed, which is more than most people associated with the Tower can say. He probably dined out on that escape story for decades. You can imagine him at dinner parties, wine in hand, telling the tale for the 100th time. Did I ever tell you about the time I escaped from the Tower of London? Yes, Ranulph, you tell us every time. Well, I'm telling you again. But his escape established something important. For the next 900 years, the Tower would confine an endless parade of prisoners, traitors, heretics, princes, pretenders, queens, and common criminals. Some would vanish mysteriously, some would walk to the scaffold on Tower Green and kneel before the executioner's axe, and a lucky few like Flambard would find a way out, though it was probably best that he made his attempt early. After that first escape, they started paying a lot more attention to security. Maybe a high window wasn't enough after all. The tower kept growing throughout the 1100s and 1200s. New walls, new towers, a moat that could be flooded from the Thames. Richard the Lionheart dug that moat in the 1190s, making the fortress even harder to approach. What's a castle without a moat, right? And here's the strange thing about living in the tower back then. Kings actually did live there. Not all the time, but regularly. The royal apartments were quite comfortable by medieval standards. Great halls where you could throw feasts, a chapel where you could pray, gardens where you could walk, all sitting right on top of the dungeons. You'd think that would be awkward. Good morning, Your Majesty. Sleep well? Oh, that screaming last night. Just the prisoners. Nothing to worry about. But that's how they thought about power back then. The king needed to be close to both sides of the coin. The velvet glove and the iron fist all in one building. The tower also became a treasury. The safest place in all of England. Where would you keep the crown jewels, the royal regalia, the wealth of an entire kingdom? Somewhere with 90-foot walls and 15-foot thick stone, obviously. Somewhere that made invaders take one look and think, you know what? Maybe not today. By 1300, the Tower of London was an imposing concentric castle, upgraded to withstand the latest threats. It bristled with archery towers and stone battlements. Military engineers from across Europe studied its design. This was state-of-the-art fortress technology. and everyone who saw it understood the message. Don't mess with the king. Don't mess with England. Don't mess with the tower. That message was carved into every stone, whispered in every rumour that spread through London's taverns. Parents used the tower to scare their children into behaving. Eat your vegetables or they'll send you to the tower. Not that the tower was actually full of children who didn't eat their vegetables, but the threat worked because everyone knew what happened inside those walls. Or rather, they imagined what happened. And imagination is often worse than reality. Sometimes. The tower employed hundreds of people by the late medieval period. Yeoman warders who guarded the prisoners, soldiers who manned the walls, clerks who kept records of everything, the master of the ordnance who managed the kingdom's weapons, the keeper of the crown jewels, whose entire job was making sure nobody walked off with the king's shiny things. Speaking of which, those jewels would become the target of one of history's most audacious heists. But that's getting ahead of ourselves by about 400 years. Of course, that message only works if people believe it, if they're scared enough to stay in line, because walls, no matter how thick, are only as strong as the soldiers defending them, and the soldiers are only as loyal as their pay. In 1381, the tower would face its first and only successful breach, not by a foreign army, not by Vikings or French knights or Spanish conquistadors, by English peasants, angry English peasants, tens of thousands of them marching on London with murder in their eyes. But that story, and the blood that followed it, is for another stretch of our journey through these ancient stones. For now, just picture the tower as it stood at the end of the 1200s. White walls glowing in the moonlight, ravens circling overhead, drawn by the smell of the kitchens and maybe something else. The moat reflecting torchlight from the battlements. A fortress that had already seen one daring escape. A prison that had already begun collecting souls. And 900 years of history still to come. Your pillow is probably pretty comfortable right now, the blanket warm around you, unlike those medieval prisoners huddled in cold cells, listening to the rats scurrying in the walls and the water dripping from the ceiling. The tower never slept. Guards walked the walls all night, calling out the hours. Church bells rang across the city. The Thames lapped against the southern walls, carrying whatever London decided to throw into it. Somewhere in those halls, future kings would pace and plan. Future queens would write desperate letters. Future children would play games in the morning sun, not knowing they'd never leave this place alive. But all of that was still to come. For now, the tower just waited. Patient as stone, collecting. The tower kept growing. More walls, more towers, more reasons for Londoners to look up and feel that knot in their stomachs. But somewhere along the way, the kings of England decided that intimidation wasn't enough. They wanted to impress people too, so they started collecting animals. Not dogs and cats, not horses, though they had plenty of those. No. The medieval kings of England wanted the weird stuff, the exotic stuff, the kind of animals that would make visiting diplomats say, "What the hell is that?" and then go home to tell everyone about the crazy English king with the menagerie. It started small, a few big cats here and there, gifts from foreign rulers trying to stay on England's good side. But by the 1200s, the Tower of London had become something nobody expected. A zoo. Picture this. You're a regular Londoner in 1252. You're walking along the Thames, maybe heading to market, thinking about fish prices or whether your neighbour's cow got into your garden again. And then you hear it. A sound that doesn't belong. A deep, rumbling growl that makes the hair on your arms stand up. You look toward the tower, and there, behind the walls, you catch a glimpse of something impossible. A polar bear. I'm not making this up. King Henry III received a polar bear as a gift from the King of Norway. A massive white bear from the frozen north, shipped all the way to London and deposited in the tower like some kind of medieval FedEx delivery. Sign here for your Arctic predator, Your Majesty. Now, keeping a polar bear alive in medieval London presented some challenges. These animals eat a lot, and the royal treasury, despite being stuffed with coins, didn't want to spend forever on bear food. So they came up with a solution, a creative solution, a solution that, if you saw it today, you would assume was a fever dream. The sheriffs of London were instructed to buy the bear a long rope and a muzzle. Every day, keepers would attach this rope to the bear's collar and walk it down to the River Thames. They'd lead a polar bear through the streets of medieval London, past the fish markets and the docks, and the people who had definitely not signed up for this, and let it swim in the river, to catch its own fish for supper. Think about that for a second. Somewhere in medieval London, there's a guy whose job title is basically bear walker. He wakes up every morning knowing that today, like yesterday, he's going to strap a rope to an apex predator and lead it through crowded streets to go fishing. What do you even put on your resume after that? Experienced in Arctic wildlife management and urban predator logistics. Crowds would gather to watch. Of course they would. This was the greatest free entertainment in 13th century England. A giant white bear from lands most Londoners couldn't even imagine, splashing around in the Thames, snatching fish with those massive paws. Kids probably beg their parents to take them. Please, father, can we go see the bear eat things? Street vendors probably set up shop nearby, selling meat pies and ale to spectators, medieval tailgating for polar bear fishing. The whole thing sounds like something someone made up, but it's right there in the historical records. The sheriffs really did buy that rope. The bear really did fish in the Thames. The bear became a celebrity. And it wasn't alone for long. 3 years later, in 1255, King Henry III received another gift. This one from the King of France. And this one was even more unbelievable than the polar bear. An elephant. The first elephant ever seen in England. Ever. In the entire history of the island, no one had laid eyes on one of these creatures. They'd heard stories, sure, ancient tales from Roman times, travellers' accounts that most people assumed were exaggerated. But now there was an actual elephant standing in a special wooden house built near the tower gates. People lost their minds. A monk named Matthew Paris actually sketched the elephant. It's one of the earliest drawings of an elephant by someone who had actually seen one, and honestly, it looks a little off. Like he couldn't quite believe what he was looking at, and his hand kept second-guessing his eyes. Londoners flocked to the tower to see this marvel. The first elephant. A creature from the edge of the world, from lands where everything was strange and wonderful, standing right there in London, eating hay and looking mildly confused about how it ended up here. Sadly, the elephant didn't last long. It died after about 2 years. The keepers had absolutely no idea how to care for an elephant. How could they? Nobody in England had ever seen one before. They were guessing, and some of their guesses were not great. One report claims they tried giving the elephant wine instead of water. They thought water might be bad for it. Wine apparently seemed like a safer bet. It wasn't. The poor creature probably died from a combination of wrong diet, wrong climate, and wrong everything. But for those 2 years, London had an elephant, the medieval equivalent of having a celebrity living in your neighbourhood. Oh yeah, the elephant. He's down by the tower. Saw him yesterday, looking a bit tired, honestly. The menagerie kept growing after that. Lions, leopards, a hyena at some point, all these dangerous animals prowling around in cages within the tower walls. At night their roars would echo across the fortress. Imagine being a prisoner, locked in your cell, listening to lions growling somewhere in the darkness. That's psychological warfare right there. Even if the lions couldn't reach you, you'd never quite believe it. The menagerie lasted for centuries, by the way, all the way until 1835, when the Duke of Wellington finally shut it down after a series of unfortunate incidents. A lion got loose, a leopard attacked a guard, the usual problems you have when you keep apex predators in medieval cages that were never designed for the job. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. Back in the 1300s, the tower was still growing, still collecting animals and prisoners and treasure, still looming over London like a stone giant that might wake up at any moment and crush everyone beneath it. The kings felt safe behind those walls, protected by stone and moat and the sheer terror the tower inspired in anyone who looked at it. They were wrong. In the summer of 1381, the tower faced its first and only breach, and it came from the last direction anyone expected. Not from France, not from Scotland, not from some foreign army with siege weapons and trained soldiers, from English peasants, tens of thousands of them, armed with farming tools and righteous fury. The peasants' revolt started over taxes. It usually does, doesn't it? The poll tax specifically, a flat tax that hit poor people way harder than rich people, because that's how flat taxes work. The peasants had been squeezed dry by years of plague and war and noble greed, and finally, in the summer of 1381, they snapped. They started marching, from Kent and Essex, from villages all across southeast England, picking up more people as they went. By the time they reached London, there were maybe 60,000 of them, maybe more. Nobody was counting carefully. They were too busy being terrified. The young King Richard II was only 14 years old. 14! Barely old enough to shave, suddenly facing the largest armed uprising in English history. His advisers hustled him into the Tower of London for protection. His mother came too, the whole royal court cowering behind those famous walls, while an ocean of angry peasants crashed against the city. The rebels wanted the king's advisers, the men they blamed for their suffering. Specifically, they wanted Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Chancellor, and they wanted Robert Hales, the royal treasurer, the money men, the policy makers, the ones who'd squeezed every last coin from people who had nothing left to give. Richard actually went out to meet the rebels. Can you imagine? 14 years old, climbing into a boat and floating down the Thames to parley with a mob that wanted blood. His advisers probably tried to stop him. Your Majesty, please, stay behind the walls. But Richard went anyway. Maybe he was brave, maybe he was naive, maybe he just didn't have any better options. The rebels were gathered at Mile End, shouting and waving their weapons, farmers with pitchforks, blacksmiths with hammers, regular people who'd been pushed too far. Richard listened to their demands. He made promises, agreed to abolish serfdom, agreed to lower taxes, said whatever he had to say to calm them down. It worked, mostly. Some of the rebels went home, satisfied that the king had heard them, but others stayed. Others wanted more than promises. They wanted blood. And while the king was away, A mob found their way to the tower. Here's where it gets murky. The garrison should have stopped them. The tower had soldiers, gates, walls, everything you need to hold off an army. But somehow, the peasants just walked in. Maybe the guards were sympathetic. Maybe they were scared. Maybe they looked at that crowd and did the math and decided they didn't get paid enough to die for Simon Sudbury. Whatever the reason, the gates opened, and the rebels poured inside. They went everywhere, ransacking the royal apartments, lounging on the king's bed. One chronicler, Jean Froissart, describes them stroking the beards of the terrified guards as if they owned the place, joking around, making themselves at home in the most secure fortress in England. But they hadn't forgotten why they came. They found Simon Sudbury in the chapel of the White Tower, the Archbishop of Canterbury, one of the most powerful men in England, hiding in a church and praying for sanctuary. He didn't find any. They dragged him out. Him and Robert Hales and several other royal officials pulled them through the crowds past the cheering rebels out to Tower Hill, and there, in broad daylight, the mob cut off their heads. It wasn't quick. The executioner, if you can even call him that, was just some guy with an axe. No training, no skill. Reports say it took 8 blows to get Sudbury's head off. 8. The Archbishop probably wasn't dead until the 3rd or 4th. Just kneeling there on Tower Hill, feeling the axe bite again and again, while a mob cheered. They stuck the heads on pikes, paraded them through London, eventually mounted them on London Bridge, where executed traitors' heads usually went. Except these weren't traitors. They were the king's own ministers, killed by the king's own subjects. Tower Hill ran with noble blood that day, and the Tower of London for the first and only time in its history had been breached. Richard II survived. He was still out negotiating when the killings happened. When he returned and saw what had become of his advisors, what did he feel? Relief that it wasn't him, rage at the rebels, fear of what might come next. Whatever he felt, he buried it. This 14-year-old boy looked at the disaster unfolding around him and made a choice. He would not run. He would not hide. He would face the mob again. The next day, Richard rode out to Smithfield to meet Wat Tyler, one of the rebel leaders. The meeting went badly. Tyler got into an argument with the king's men. Someone drew a weapon. Tyler was stabbed, pulled from his horse, and killed on the spot. The rebels surged forward, ready to avenge their fallen leader. And Richard, this teenage king who just watched his advisors get butchered, rode straight toward them. "You shall have no captain but me," he shouted, or something like that. The chroniclers disagree on the exact words, but the meaning was clear. "Follow me. I'm your king. I'm all you've got now." And somehow, impossibly, they did. The rebels followed Richard away from Smithfield, followed him until his forces could surround them, followed him until it was too late to do anything but surrender. Within a few weeks the revolt had collapsed and the leaders were being hunted down and executed. Richard's promises disappeared like morning fog. Serfdom continued. The taxes came back. Everything the rebels had fought for evaporated, but the events of 1381 became part of the Tower's legend forever. Never again would anyone assume those walls were impenetrable. Never again would the garrison get complacent. The Tower's power came from fear, and fear only works if people believe in it. After that summer, they believed a little less. New security measures went into place, new protocols, the kind of changes you make when you've just watched a mob drag your Lord Chancellor out of a chapel and hack his head off in front of a cheering crowd. The tower adapted. It always did. That was its gift. 900 years of adapting to whatever England threw at it. New threats, new rulers, new definitions of treason. The medieval period was winding down, though nobody living through it knew that. The Wars of the Roses were coming, the Tudors after that, and the tower was about to enter its bloodiest era. Kings would be murdered in their sleep. Princes would vanish without a trace. Queens would kneel before the executioner's sword on Tower Green. But for now, in the aftermath of the revolt, the tower just sat there, licking its wounds, repairing its reputation, waiting for the next chapter. The lions still roared at night. The ravens still circled overhead. The Thames still lapped against the southern walls, carrying away whatever secrets the tower wanted to forget. And somewhere in those cells, prisoners scratched another day into the stone, wondering if tomorrow would be the day they walked free, or the day they didn't walk at all. Your bed is probably feeling pretty comfortable right now. Soft mattress, clean sheets, no sounds of lions in the darkness or mobs at the gates. Just quiet, just warmth, just the story of 1,000 years, unfolding slowly as you drift. The tower remembers everything, every betrayal, every execution, every midnight prayer from someone who knew they'd never see morning. But you don't have to remember tonight, you just have to listen. The 15th century was not kind to England, or to anyone who wanted to be king of it. Two families had been ripping each other apart for decades. The House of York with their white rose, the House of Lancaster with their red. The Wars of the Roses, historians would later call it, which makes it sound almost romantic. It wasn't. It was cousins killing cousins, brothers betraying brothers, heads on spikes and bodies in shallow graves, and a throne that changed hands so often nobody could keep track anymore. And through all of it, the Tower of London kept doing what it had always done, collecting. The tower became a dumping ground for overthrown kings during these years, a place to stash the losers until someone decided what to do with them. Sometimes they walked out, sometimes they didn't walk at all. King Henry the Earl was one of the ones who didn't. Henry was a gentle man, too gentle for the savage world he'd been born into. He liked books and prayer and quiet contemplation. He founded Eton College and King's College at Cambridge. He cared about education and charity and all the soft things that get you killed when you're supposed to be a warrior king. The Yorkists deposed him in 1461, put Edward IV on the throne instead. Henry spent years in hiding, wandering through the north of England like a ghost, protected by loyalists who still believed in the old king. Eventually they caught him, brought him to London in chains, threw him in the Tower. He was held in the Wakefield Tower, a round stone chamber with narrow windows and a private chapel where he could pray. Henry prayed a lot. It was pretty much all he had left. For a while, it looked like he might survive. Edward IV didn't seem eager to kill him. Maybe he thought a living Henry, locked away and harmless, was less dangerous than a dead Henry who could become a martyr. Political calculations, chess moves with human pieces. But then Henry's supporters made one last desperate push. They freed him briefly in 1470, put him back on the throne for a few chaotic months. It didn't last. Edward IV came roaring back, crushed the Lancastrian army at the Battle of Tewkesbury, and threw Henry right back in the Tower. This time, there would be no reprieve. On the night of May 21st, 1471, Henry VI died in his cell. The official story said he died of melancholy. Pure grief, basically. His heart just gave out from sadness, which is a lovely poetic explanation that absolutely nobody believed. Everyone knew he'd been murdered, probably stabbed, maybe strangled. The orders almost certainly came from Edward IV or from his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Someone wanted Henry dead, and someone made it happen. Legend says Henry was kneeling in prayer when his killer entered the room, that he looked up from his devotions and saw death walking toward him, and simply accepted it. The Holy King, meeting his end in the chapel of the Wakefield Tower, blood spreading across the stone floor. People claimed to see his ghost afterward. Every year on the anniversary of his death, witnesses reported a pale figure wandering the tower grounds. Henry VI still praying, still waiting, still wondering why the world was so cruel to gentle men. But Henry's death was just the beginning. The tower was about to witness something even darker, a crime so terrible that 500 years later, people still argue about who did it. The princes in the tower. Edward III died suddenly in April 1483. He was only 40 years old, in good health, and then he was just gone. Some kind of fever, maybe poison. Nobody knew for sure. He left behind 2 sons, Edward, 12 years old, now King Edward V, and Richard, 9 years old, Duke of York. 2 boys who had no idea their lives were about to become a nightmare. Edward Thorpe had named his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector. Uncle Richard would look after the boys until young Edward was old enough to rule on his own. A straightforward plan, a sensible arrangement. Nothing about what followed was sensible. Uncle Richard intercepted young Edward on his way to London for his coronation, dismissed the boy's household, arrested several of his guardians, brought Edward to the Tower of London supposedly for his own protection. The Tower, where kings went to prepare for their coronations, sure, but also where kings went to disappear. A few weeks later, Uncle Richard convinced the boy's mother to send her younger son to join his brother. Richard, the 9-year-old, was pulled from sanctuary at Westminster Abbey, told he was going to keep his brother company, told everything would be fine. He walked into the Tower of London in June of 1483. He never walked out. Try to imagine those first days for the 2 brothers. Edward, the older one, probably understood what was happening. He'd been raised to be king. He knew about politics and power and how quickly fortunes could change. He knew his uncle's reputation. Richard, the younger boy, probably didn't understand at all. 9 years old, suddenly ripped away from his mother, told he was going to play with his brother. Excited, maybe, to see Edward again, not knowing that protection sometimes means imprisonment when you're talking about medieval royals. They had servants, they had food, they had comfortable rooms by Tower standards, but they also had guards. And the guards reported to their uncle, not to them. For a while, people saw the boys around the Tower grounds. They'd catch glimpses of them playing in the gardens, shooting arrows at targets, running around the courtyards like normal children, except for the guards always watching. Always watching. An Italian diplomat named Dominic Mancini was in London that summer. He wrote about the princes, described how they were seen less and less as the weeks went by, like they were fading, disappearing in slow motion right before everyone's eyes. Mancini also wrote something haunting about Edward, the older boy. A doctor visited him regularly, and the doctor reported that Edward sought remission of his sins by daily confession and penance, because he believed that death was facing him. 12 years old, confessing his sins every day, preparing to die. What does a 12-year-old even confess? Not sharing his toys? being mean to his little brother. And here he was, kneeling in some cold tower chapel, asking God's forgiveness because he knew, somehow, that he wouldn't survive this. By autumn of 1483, the boys had vanished entirely. No more glimpses in the gardens, no more sounds of children playing, just silence from the royal apartments where two princes had been living. And their uncle, their devoted uncle who was supposed to protect them, he was busy having Parliament declare the boys illegitimate, busy claiming that Edward their's marriage had been invalid all along, busy putting a crown on his own head and calling himself King Richard III. Nobody asked where the boys had gone. Nobody dared. Richard was king now, and kings don't appreciate awkward questions about missing nephews. But people whispered. They always do. The whispers said Richard had ordered it done, sent men into the prince's chamber one night, had them smothered with pillows while they slept. Two boys, probably curled up together because they were scared and alone and all they had was each other. And then the pillow pressing down. And then nothing. A writer named Thomas Moore recorded one version of the story a few decades later. He said a man named James Tyrrell confessed to organising the murders, said two men crept into the bedchamber at midnight, wrapped the boys in blankets, and held them down until they stopped moving. Then they buried them, somewhere in the tower, under a staircase maybe, a shallow grave for two princes who should have been kings. Is the story true? Maybe. Moore was writing 40 years after the fact, working for the Tudors, who had every reason to make Richard III look like a monster. History is written by the winners, and the Tudors definitely won. But here's the thing. In 1674, nearly 200 years later, workmen were doing repairs in the Tower of London. They were digging around the base of a staircase leading up to the White Tower Chapel. Just routine maintenance, fixing some stones. And then their shovels hit something. Bones, two skeletons, small ones, children. They were buried about 10 feet deep, under the rubble and foundation stones, hidden so well that 2 centuries of residents had walked over them every single day without knowing. The workmen reburied them at first, probably thinking nothing of it. Old buildings have old bones. London is practically built on bones. Medieval plagues, Roman graveyards. Every time you dig in London, you find somebody. But then someone important found out about the discovery. Someone who knew the story of the princes. Someone who realised what those bones might mean. King Charles II ordered the bones exhumed, examined, and then, in 1678, he had them placed in a marble urn and interred at Westminster Abbey, right there with the other kings and queens of England. The inscription on the urn reads, "Here lie the remains of Edward V, King of England, and Richard, Duke of York." Case closed? Not exactly. Scientists examined the bones in 1933. They thought the skeletons matched the ages of the princes, but they couldn't determine the sex, couldn't pin down the date of death with any precision. The bones were old, yes. Child-sized, yes. But were they really Edward and Richard? Or just 2 random medieval children who died of plague or accident or any of the 1,000 things that killed kids back then? The Abbey has refused to allow modern DNA testing, so we'll probably never know for sure. The bones rest in their marble urn, and the mystery remains unsolved. Maybe Richard III did it. He had the motive and the opportunity. Those boys stood between him and the throne, and once they were gone, nobody could challenge his claim. Or maybe it was the Duke of Buckingham. He was close to Richard at first, then turned against him. Some historians think Buckingham killed the princes on his own, hoping to blame Richard later, or maybe, just maybe, the boys survived. There were pretenders later, men who claimed to be the lost princes all grown up. One of them, a guy called Perkin Warbeck, was so convincing that European courts treated him like royalty for years. Was he really Richard, the younger prince somehow escaped? Probably not. But the fact that people believed him shows how much everyone wanted a different ending to this story. Because the ending we got is unbearable. 2 children, 12 and 9 years old, betrayed by the uncle who was supposed to protect them, murdered in their sleep and buried under a staircase like garbage. And we don't even know for certain who gave the order. The tower has seen a lot of death. Executions with ceremonies and crowds and official warrants signed by kings. But this was different. This was secret. This was small bodies in a shallow grave and a conspiracy of silence that lasted for centuries. When people say the Tower of London is haunted, the princes are usually the first ghosts they mention. 2 small figures holding hands gliding down the corridors late at night, wearing the white nightgowns they died in, looking for someone to help them. Guards have reported seeing them for centuries, always the same description. 2 boys, holding hands, silent, moving through the walls like they're not even there, which of course, they're not. They haven't been there for 500 years. If ghosts are real, if they're the echoes of violent deaths and unfinished business, then the princes have every right to haunt this place. Betrayed by family, murdered in their sleep, buried in secret and forgotten for 200 years. That's enough unfinished business for a dozen ghosts. Nobody ever helps them. How could they? It's been 500 years. The boys are beyond helping now. Richard III didn't last long after the princes disappeared. 2 years later, he was dead on Bosworth Field, killed by the army of Henry Tudor, the last English king to die in battle. They stripped his corpse, threw it over a horse, and paraded it through the streets so everyone could see that the king who stole the throne was finally gone. No grave for Richard. Not a proper one anyway. Not for centuries. They tossed his body in a hastily dug pit at Greyfriars Friary and forgot about it. The church was torn down during Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries. The exact location of Richard's body was lost. Only in 2012 did archaeologists find his skeleton under a parking lot in Leicester. Scoliosis curving his spine, just like the Tudor propaganda had always claimed. Wounds on his skull from the battle that killed him. A blade through the back of the head. The king who maybe murdered 2 children, finally dug up and examined like evidence at a crime scene. They reburied him properly in Leicester Cathedral in 2015. Gave him the royal funeral he never got. Some people showed up to mourn, others showed up to curse. Even 500 years later, Richard III can still start an argument. But that still doesn't tell us what really happened in the tower that autumn of 1483. Doesn't tell us who gave the order. Doesn't tell us if those bones in Westminster Abbey are really the boys. Some mysteries don't get solved. They just get older. You're safe tonight. Warm in your bed. No uncles with ambitions. No guards outside your door. No cold tower walls closing in around you. Just the story. Just the ghosts of 2 boys who never got to grow up. The tower kept their secret for nearly 200 years. Kept those bones hidden under a staircase while kings and queens came and went overhead. And even now, even with the bones moved to Westminster, the tower remembers. It always remembers. The Tudors changed everything about the tower. Before them, the fortress had been a prison, sure, a place where traitors waited and sometimes died. but the Tudors turned it into something else entirely. A machine, a factory for producing corpses on a royal schedule, and no Tudor was more prolific at filling the tower than Henry VIII. You probably know the rhyme about Henry's 6 wives: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Cute little memory trick that glosses over the fact that 2 of those women had their heads cut off in the Tower of London while their husband watched from a comfortable distance. Anne Boleyn was the second wife, the one Henry tore apart his entire kingdom to marry. He broke with the Catholic Church, declared himself head of the Church of England, and burned centuries of tradition to the ground, all because he wanted Anne. And then, 3 years later, he wanted her dead. Anne arrived at the Tower on May 2nd, 1536. She came by barge, sliding down the Thames on a grey afternoon. The same river she'd travelled for her coronation 3 years earlier, when the whole city celebrated and cannons fired salutes, and everyone pretended to be happy that Henry had finally gotten rid of his Spanish wife. This time there were no cannons, no cheering crowds, just the water slapping against the boat and the looming walls getting closer. She entered through Traitor's Gate, the water entrance, the one reserved for prisoners accused of crimes against the crown. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, pulled through an archway that practically had "You're going to die here" carved into the stones. The constable of the Tower met her at the gate, Sir William Kingston, a man who had the unfortunate job of keeping doomed royals comfortable before their executions. He would write detailed reports about Anne's final days, preserving her words for history. We know what she said because Kingston wrote it all down. When Anne stepped onto the landing, she asked Kingston a question. Would she be placed in a dungeon? No, he told her. She would be lodged in the royal apartments, the same rooms where she'd stayed before her coronation. Anne laughed. The kind of laugh that isn't really laughing. She said the lodging was too good for her. Then she fell to her knees and started weeping. Then she started laughing again, weeping and laughing back and forth, while Kingston stood there awkwardly and guards pretended not to watch. She was having a breakdown. Right there on the stones of the tower, the Queen was cracking apart. Can you blame her? 2 days earlier, she'd been at a jousting tournament, watching knights compete in her honour. Henry had been there too, sitting beside her in the royal box. Then a messenger arrived. Henry read the message, stood up without a word and left. Just walked out. Didn't even look at Anne. She never saw him again. Within hours she'd been arrested, accused of adultery, accused of treason, accused of plotting to kill the king, accused of sleeping with 5 different men, including her own brother, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford. The person she'd grown up with, confided in, relied on through all the chaos of court life. They said she'd committed incest with him, that the 2 of them had conspired together against the king. George was arrested too, thrown in the tower right alongside his sister. They would die within days of each other, executed for crimes they didn't commit, separated by walls but probably close enough to hear each other's footsteps in the night. None of it was true. Historians have picked apart the charges for 5 centuries, and the conclusion is pretty much unanimous. Anne Boleyn was framed. Henry wanted a new wife, a wife who could give him a son, and the only way to get one was to get rid of Anne permanently. Divorce wasn't enough this time. He needed her dead. Anne had given him a daughter, Elizabeth, the future Virgin Queen, but daughters didn't count. Not to Henry. He needed a male heir, a boy to continue his dynasty, and Anne had failed. Worse, she'd recently miscarried a son. Henry saw it as a sign from God. His marriage was cursed. Anne was cursed. So they invented crimes, tortured a musician named Mark Smeaton until he confessed to sleeping with the Queen, arrested 4 other men on equally flimsy evidence, built a case out of gossip and innuendo and forced confessions. The trial was a formality. Everyone knew the verdict before they even called the first witness. Anne spent 17 days in the Tower, 17 days of waiting, of not knowing exactly when it would happen, of pacing those royal apartments where she'd once dressed for her coronation, wearing the same walls like a cage now. Kingston reported that her mood swung wildly. Sometimes she was calm, almost serene, joking with her ladies about how she'd be known as Queen Anne Lackhead, dark humour from a woman staring down a headsman's blade. Other times she broke down completely, wept for hours, prayed on her knees until her legs went numb, asked over and over if she would feel any pain. She asked Kingston about the execution itself. He tried to reassure her. The executioner was very good, he said, very experienced. Anne touched her own throat. Her neck was small, she said. It would be easy. Then she laughed again, that broken laugh. On May 19th, 1536, they came for her. Henry had granted her one small mercy. Instead of an English headsman with an axe, he'd sent for a French swordsman from Calais. The best in the business, a man who could take a head off with one clean stroke. An axe, you see, wasn't always reliable. It was heavy and blunt and required a lot of force. Sometimes it took 2 swings, 3, more. The crowd would watch as the executioner hacked away at some poor soul's neck, blood everywhere, the victim still alive and screaming after the first blow. A sword was different, lighter, sharper. In the hands of an expert, it cut through bone and muscle before the victim even knew what was happening. It was considered the most humane way to die by decapitation, a courtesy reserved for royalty and high nobility. Henry wanted Anne dead, but he didn't want her to suffer. Maybe that was love. Maybe it was just good publicity. Either way, he paid extra for the specialist from Calais. The execution was supposed to happen on the 18th, but it got delayed. Something about the swordsman not arriving in time. Anne had to wait an extra day, an extra night of not sleeping, of knowing exactly what the morning would bring, of watching the sun set and knowing she'd never see another one. When Kingston told her about the delay, she was distraught. She'd prepared herself, steeled herself, and now she had to do it all over again. "I hear the executioner is very good," Kingston told her, trying to offer some comfort. Anne put her hands around her throat. "I have only a little neck," she said. Then that laugh again, that horrible broken laugh. When the moment finally came, she walked out to Tower Green with steady steps. A small crowd had gathered, not the massive mob of a public execution on Tower Hill, just a few hundred witnesses carefully selected. Henry wanted this done quietly. Anne wore a grey damask gown with a red petticoat underneath. Her dark hair was pinned up, leaving her neck bare. She carried a small prayer book, her fingers probably white from gripping it too hard. She made a short speech, praised Henry as a good and gentle king, asked the crowd to pray for her soul, never admitted to any crime, but never protested her innocence either. Just a few careful words, chosen to protect her daughter Elizabeth, who was only 2 years old. If Anne had raged against Henry, if she'd proclaimed her innocence from the scaffold, it might have made things worse for the little girl she was leaving behind. So she said nothing that could be used against her family. Even facing death, she was thinking about Elizabeth. The swordsman was standing off to the side, hidden among the crowd. He didn't mount the scaffold with his weapon drawn, didn't let Anne see the blade coming. She knelt in the straw, still praying, and he came up behind her silently. There was a trick executioners used. To make it quick and clean, they needed the victim to stretch their neck, to hold perfectly still. So he said something, called out to an assistant about the sword. Anne turned her head slightly toward the sound. One stroke. That's all it took. The French swordsman was worth every penny Henry paid him. Her ladies wrapped the head and body in white cloth. Nobody had remembered to order a coffin, so they found an old arrow chest and used that instead. Crammed the Queen of England into a box meant for storing arrows and buried her under the floor of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, right there in the tower. She never left. 6 years later, Henry sent another wife to the same place. Catherine Howard was young, probably around 17 when she married the king, though her exact birth date is lost. She was bubbly, flirtatious, full of life, everything that Anne had been, but without Anne's sharp intelligence. She was also terrified of Henry. Who wouldn't be? By 1540 he was 50 years old, massively overweight, with a rotting ulcer on his leg that stank so badly courtiers would gag when they got too close. The handsome young king who had courted Anne Boleyn was long gone. In his place was a monster in constant pain, with a hair-trigger temper and a growing list of dead ex-wives. Catherine's crime was simpler than Anne's. She actually had been with other men before her marriage, and she may have been with one of them after, Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber. Whether they actually committed adultery or just wrote some indiscreet letters is still debated. But it didn't matter. Once Henry found out about her past, once he saw those love letters she'd written to Culpeper, Catherine was finished. They arrested her in November 1541, dragged her screaming from her chambers at Hampton Court. She reportedly broke free from the guards and ran down a gallery toward the chapel where Henry was hearing Mass, shrieking for him to listen, to forgive her, to give her a chance to explain. He never opened the door. They took her to the Tower in February 1542. She was probably 18 years old, maybe 19. Nobody kept very good records of birthdays for girls back then. Girls were just married off when they looked old enough, and Catherine had looked old enough at maybe 15 or 16. She'd been queen for less than 2 years. Had spent most of that time trying to keep an aging, temperamental king happy, while sneaking glances at younger men who didn't smell like rotting flesh. Can you really blame her? Catherine didn't have Anne's composure. She was hysterical for most of her imprisonment, crying constantly, begging for mercy that would never come, asking for her mother, even though her mother had been dead for years. She was a child who'd been thrown to a monster and was now paying the price for trying to survive. The night before her execution, she asked for the block to be brought to her cell. She wanted to practice, to figure out how to position her head so the axe would fall cleanly. A teenage girl kneeling in front of a wooden block in her prison cell, rehearsing her own death because she didn't want to mess it up in the morning. Think about that for a second. She was going to die, and she knew it, and she couldn't stop it. But she could control one thing. She could make sure she did it right. She could die with dignity, even if she hadn't been able to live with it. On February 13th, 1542, Catherine Howard walked out to Tower Green. Same scaffold, same spot where her cousin Anne had died 6 years earlier. The executioner was waiting. The block was the same one she'd practiced on. She was too weak to make much of a speech. just asked people to pray for her soul. Then she knelt down, laid her head on the block she'd practiced with the night before, and waited for the axe. They buried her next to Anne. Two of Henry's queens lying side by side under the chapel floor, cousins in life, neighbours in death. Henry would marry 4 more times after Catherine. Jane Seymour died giving him a son. Anne of Cleves he divorced. Catherine Parr outlived him. The Tower didn't claim any more of his wives, but it had already taken enough. The chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula is still there. You can visit it today if you take the Tower tour. There's a memorial marking the spot where Anne and Catherine are buried, along with other executed nobles. Tour guides will tell you it's one of the most haunted spots in London. Visitors report feeling suddenly cold, hearing whispers, sensing presences that shouldn't be there. A woman in a grey dress glimpsed in the corner of your eye, gone when you turn to look. Anne, they say, still walking the grounds where she spent her last days, still touching her throat where the sword cut clean. Maybe it's all nonsense, ghost stories for tourists, but standing in that chapel, knowing what happened there, knowing who's buried under your feet, it's hard not to feel something, hard not to imagine a dark-haired woman in a grey gown, pacing and praying, waiting for a morning that would never bring mercy. 17 days of waiting, 1 clean stroke, and 500 years of people still talking about her. That's Anne Boleyn's legacy. Not the love that started a revolution, not the daughter who became England's greatest queen, the Tower, the scaffold, the arrow chest for a coffin. Henry lived another 11 years after Anne died, got his son eventually, died fat and paranoid in 1547, surrounded by courtiers too frightened to tell him he was dying. Anne got 17 days. The Tower kept her, though, keeps her still. Henry VIII died in 1547, but the Tower kept busy. His son Edward VI took the throne at 9 years old. A sickly boy, pale and thin, coughin' his way through a reign that everyone knew wouldn't last long. Edward was Protestant, fiercely so, and he surrounded himself with Protestant advisers who wanted to make sure the Reformation stuck. The problem was the line of succession. If Edward died without an heir, the crown would pass to his half-sister Mary. Catholic Mary. Mary, who wanted to drag England back to Rome and undo everything Edward and his advisers had built. So they made a plan. A stupid, desperate, doomed plan. They found a teenage girl named Jane Grey. Jane was 15 years old, bookish, serious, fluent in Greek and Latin. She spent her days studying scripture and writing letters to Protestant theologians on the continent. She had no interest in politics, no ambition for power, no desire to be anything other than a scholar. But she had royal blood. Her grandmother had been Henry VIII's sister. That made Jane a distant heir to the throne, far enough removed that she'd never normally matter, but close enough to be useful if you wanted to skip over the Catholic princesses. Edward's advisers, led by the Duke of Northumberland, convinced the dying king to change the succession. Bypass Mary, bypass Elizabeth, put Jane on the throne instead. Oh, and marry Jane to Northumberland's son first, just to make sure the Duke stayed in power. Jane didn't want any of it. When they told her she was going to be queen, she reportedly fainted. Then she cried. Then she tried to refuse. But nobody cared what Jane wanted. She was a piece on a chessboard, and the men playing the game had already decided where she'd go. Edward died on July 6, 1553. 4 days later, Jane was proclaimed Queen in London. She lasted 9 days. 9 days of wearing a crown she never asked for. 9 days of signing documents with hands that probably shook. 9 days of pretending to be a monarch while everyone around her scrambled to secure their positions. Then Mary arrived with an army, and the whole thing collapsed. The people of England, it turned out, didn't much care about Protestant succession plans cooked up by scheming dukes. They cared about legitimacy. Mary was Henry VIII's daughter. Jane was some random cousin nobody had heard of. The choice was obvious. Northumberland surrendered. His allies fled or switched sides. And Jane? Jane went to the Tower, not as a queen this time, as a prisoner. They kept her in the gentleman jailer's house, which sounds almost pleasant until you remember she was waiting to die. Her husband, Guildford Dudley, was held separately in the Beauchamp Tower. They could see each other's prisons from certain windows, could wave, maybe, if the guards allowed it. 2 teenagers who'd been married against their will, imprisoned for a scheme they hadn't invented, waiting to find out if they'd survive. Jane spent her days reading, praying, writing letters to her family. She was allowed books, at least, her beloved Greek texts, her Latin scriptures, whatever comfort she could find in those pages while the walls closed in around her. She also received visitors. Catholic priests came to try to convert her. If Jane would renounce Protestantism, maybe Mary would be more merciful. Maybe there was a way out. Jane refused. Politely, firmly, completely. She debated theology with these priests, matching them argument for argument, holding her ground even though her life might depend on giving in. Her faith was the one thing she'd chosen for herself, the one thing nobody had forced on her. She wouldn't surrender it. For a while, it looked like they might survive anyway. Mary wasn't eager to execute her young cousin. Jane was a pawn, not a mastermind. Everyone knew that. Mary wanted to be merciful, wanted to show she was different from her father, different from the bloody tyrant who'd killed his wives and his friends with equal indifference. But then there was a rebellion. Thomas Wyatt led an uprising against Mary's planned marriage to Philip of Spain. The rebels marched on London, and even though Jane had nothing to do with it, even though she was locked in the Tower the whole time, Mary's advisors convinced her that Jane was too dangerous to live. As long as Jane breathed, Protestants would have a figurehead to rally around. The death warrant was signed. On February 12, 1554, Guildford Dudley was executed first. They took him to Tower Hill, the public execution ground, where crowds could watch and jeer. He was maybe 17 years old. Walked out to the scaffold, said his prayers, laid his head on the block. Jane was watching from a window. She saw the cart come back, saw her husband's body, headless, wrapped in bloody cloth, saw them carry what was left of him past her prison toward the chapel where he'd be buried. "Oh, Guildford, Guildford," she reportedly said. An hour later, it was her turn. They didn't take Jane to Tower Hill. Too risky. A 16-year-old girl crying and praying, being led to her death in front of thousands. The crowd might turn ugly, might feel sympathy, might start asking uncomfortable questions about why exactly this child had to die. So they built a scaffold on Tower Green instead. Private, contained. Just a few dozen witnesses, carefully selected. Jane walked out in a simple black dress. She carried a prayer book, gripped so tight her knuckles were white. Her ladies-in-waiting followed behind her, weeping. Jane wasn't weeping. Not yet. She made a short speech, admitted that she'd broken the law by accepting the crown, even though she'd been pressured into it, asked the small crowd to pray for her soul, never blamed Mary, never blamed the men who'd put her in this position, Just a quiet admission of technical guilt and a request for prayers. Then she knelt. The executioner asked her forgiveness, as tradition required. She gave it, told him to dispatch her quickly. Then she tied a blindfold over her own eyes. And here's where it went wrong. Jane couldn't see the block. She'd blindfolded herself before getting into position, and now she was kneeling in darkness, hands outstretched, feeling for wood that wasn't where she expected it. "What shall I do?" she asked. "Where is it?" Nobody moved. The witnesses stood frozen. The executioner waited, and this 16-year-old girl, blinded by her own hand, fumbled around on the scaffold floor, searching for the block where she was supposed to lay her head. Finally, someone guided her, helped her find it. She stretched her neck across the wood and whispered her final words, "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." One stroke. It was over. They buried her in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, next to Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. Another woman killed for being inconvenient. Another body under the chapel floor. The famous painting of Jane's execution, the one by Paul Delaroche, captures that moment of blindfolded confusion. Jane in white groping forward, while a man guides her toward the block. It's not historically accurate in the details, but it gets something right about the horror, the helplessness, the way even death couldn't be dignified when you were blindfolded and alone and nobody would tell you where to put your head. But Jane wasn't the only woman who died badly in the Tower during these years. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, had the worst death of all. Margaret was old, 67 years old in 1541, which was ancient by Tudor standards. She'd survived decades of political chaos. Her father had been executed by Edward IV, her brother had been executed by Henry VII. She'd outlived them all, navigating the treacherous waters of court life with a combination of caution and stubbornness. But she had Plantagenet blood, royal blood from the old dynasty, and Henry VIII had become paranoid about anyone with a claim to the throne, however distant. When Margaret's son Reginald Pole denounced Henry's religious policies from the safety of Rome, Henry couldn't touch him, so he went after the family instead. Arrested Margaret, threw her in the Tower, charged her with treason based on the flimsiest of evidence. She was kept in brutal conditions. Cold cells, inadequate food, no warm clothes for an elderly woman in an English winter. She reportedly had to beg for basic necessities. The richest woman in England, reduced to pleading for a blanket. Henry let her rot for 2.5 years. Maybe he was hoping she'd die on her own, spare him the awkwardness of executing a 67-year-old lady. But Margaret was stubborn. She refused to die conveniently. So on May 27th, 1541, they came for her. The execution was rushed. No proper scaffold, no skilled headsman, just a low wooden block and a young, inexperienced executioner who had probably never killed anyone before. Margaret refused to kneel, refused to lay her head on the block like a common criminal. She was a Plantagenet, descended from kings, and she would not grovel for these upstart Tudors. "So should traitors do," she reportedly said, "but I am none." What happened next was butchery. The young executioner swung his axe, missed her neck, hit her shoulder instead. Margaret screamed, tried to get up. He swung again, missed again, struck her head but didn't sever it. Blood everywhere now. Margaret still moving, still alive, this ancient woman being hacked apart in slow motion. It took 11 strokes to kill her. 11! Witnesses were horrified. Even by the standards of Tudor executions, this was beyond the pale. One account describes Margaret trying to run from the block, the executioner chasing her, swinging wildly. It reads like a nightmare. It probably was one for everyone who had to watch. They threw what was left of her into the chapel with the others. Another body for the pile, another ghost for the tower. But not everyone who entered the tower died there. 2 months after Jane Grey's execution, another young woman arrived at Traitor's Gate. She was 20 years old, red-haired, terrified, and she would one day become the greatest monarch England had ever known, Princess Elizabeth. Mary had turned on her half-sister, suspected her of involvement in Wyatt's rebellion, probably suspected her of just existing, of being Protestant, of being Anne Boleyn's daughter. All the old hatreds between their mothers, Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, had been inherited by the daughters. Elizabeth was arrested and brought to the Tower by barge. When she reached Traitor's Gate, the water entrance, she refused to get out, sat in the boat in the pouring rain, arguing with her guards. "Here lands as true a subject as ever landed at these stairs," she finally said as she stepped onto the wet stones. Then she sat down on them, just sat there, in the rain, refusing to move. A guard urged her to come inside. It was wet. It was cold. She was getting soaked. "Better sitting here than in a worse place," Elizabeth replied. She knew where she was, knew what happened to people who entered through that gate. Her own mother had come through there 18 years before and never left alive. Eventually they got her inside, lodged her in the bell tower, the same rooms where Thomas More had been kept before his execution, the same rooms where Anne Boleyn had waited for death. Elizabeth knew the history, knew she was sleeping in the shadow of the dead. She scratched words on her window with a diamond ring, poems about her imprisonment, her innocence, her fear. Some say she wrote on the glass itself, others that she carved into the stone walls. Either way, she was leaving her mark, making sure that if she died here, something of her would remain. She also wrote letters, careful, desperate letters to Mary, protesting her innocence, begging for an audience, asking to at least face her accuser, to know what evidence existed against her. Mary refused to see her, wouldn't even read the letters at first. The half-sisters who'd once been close, back when Elizabeth was a child and Mary was her kind older sister, were now enemies, and enemies didn't get audiences. Elizabeth spent 2 months in the Tower, 2 months of not knowing if each day would be her last, 2 months of watching other prisoners come and go, some to freedom, some to the scaffold, 2 months of waiting for Mary to decide whether a half-sister was worth killing. She was allowed to walk in the Tower garden sometimes, under heavy guard. Even that small freedom was controversial. Some of Mary's advisers wanted Elizabeth kept in total isolation. They said she was too dangerous, too charming, too likely to win sympathy from her guards. There's a story, probably apocryphal but telling nonetheless, about a little boy, the son of one of the Tower officials, maybe 4 or 5 years old. He would bring Elizabeth flowers when she walked in the garden, tiny bouquets of whatever was blooming, offered up by small hands to the imprisoned princess. When Mary's council heard about this, they were furious, interrogated the child's father, demanded to know if he was part of some conspiracy. The man barely escaped punishment. That was the atmosphere Elizabeth lived in. Every kindness was suspicious. Every friendly face was a potential trap. Every day could bring the order that would end her life. She reportedly slept badly, jumped at unexpected noises, examined her food carefully before eating, paranoid about poison. 20 years old, stuck in a stone prison, listening for footsteps that might be coming to take her to the scaffold. In the end, Mary couldn't do it. There was no evidence, no proof of Elizabeth's involvement in any plot. Executing her would look like murder, not justice. And Mary, whatever her faults, wanted to be seen as just. On May 19th, 1554, Elizabeth was released from the Tower. May 19th, the anniversary of Anne Boleyn's execution. The day her mother had died on that same ground 18 years earlier. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe someone in Mary's court had a cruel sense of humour. Elizabeth walked out through the same gate she'd entered, climbed into a barge, floated away down the Thames, never looked back. She would return to the Tower 4 years later, not as a prisoner, as a queen. Mary died in 1558, and Elizabeth inherited the crown that had almost killed her. She processed through the Tower before her coronation, the way monarchs always did. But she must have felt them, all those ghosts. Her mother's ghost, most of all. The woman who died so Elizabeth could be born, whose blood had soaked into the stones of Tower Green. Elizabeth would reign for 45 years, beat the Spanish Armada, preside over a golden age of English culture, become one of history's most legendary rulers, and it all almost ended in the Tower, almost ended with her head on a block, another body for the chapel floor. She never forgot it, never forgot how close she'd come. For the rest of her life, Elizabeth kept May 19th as a private day of mourning, a day to remember her mother, a day to remember her own survival. The Tower had let her go. It didn't let everyone go, but it let Elizabeth go. Maybe that was the real miracle. The Tower had many purposes over the centuries: royal residence, armoury, mint, menagerie, prison. But there was one purpose nobody talked about in polite company. Somewhere in the bowels of the fortress, below the grand halls and comfortable apartments, there were rooms designed for one thing only: making people talk. The English government didn't officially approve of torture, not like the French with their elaborate judicial systems built around it. In England, torture required special authorization, a royal warrant signed by the monarch or the Privy Council. It was supposed to be rare, reserved for the most serious cases: treason, conspiracy, threats to the realm. In practice, those warrants came more often than anyone wanted to admit. The Tower's basement held the equipment, heavy iron devices, some of them centuries old, maintained by men whose job titles never appeared in official records. These weren't executioners. Executioners worked in public, performed a civic duty, went home to their families afterward. The men who worked in the Tower's dungeons operated in shadow. Their names are mostly lost to history. The rack was the most famous. You've probably heard of it. A wooden frame, about the size of a bed, with rollers at each end. The prisoners' wrists were tied to one roller, their ankles to the other. Then the torturer started turning, slowly, inch by inch. The body stretching, joints separating, muscles tearing. The pain was supposed to be indescribable. Prisoners would confess to anything just to make it stop. Confess to crimes they'd committed, crimes they hadn't committed, crimes they'd never even heard of. The rack at the Tower had a nickname: the Duke of Exeter's daughter, named after a constable who had supposedly improved the design in the 1400s, made it more efficient at pulling people apart. Gallows humour. The kind of joke that only makes sense when you're surrounded by horror. Then there was the scavenger's daughter, the opposite of the rack. Instead of stretching the body out, this device compressed it. An iron frame that forced the victim into a crouching position, head pressed down to knees, body folded in half. The pressure built gradually. Blood vessels burst, bleeding from the nose and ears. Some prisoners' ribs cracked under the strain. A man named Skevington invented it during Henry VIII's reign, so it was also called Skevington's gyves. Another charming nickname for another charming device. There were the manacles too, iron cuffs attached to the ceiling by chains. Prisoners were suspended by their wrists, feet barely touching the ground, for hours at a time. The weight of their own bodies slowly dislocated their shoulders. Guards would come back to find prisoners, hanging limp, arms twisted at unnatural angles, too broken to even scream anymore. And there was the little ease, not a torture device exactly, more like a cell, a tiny stone closet maybe 4 feet on each side, too small to stand up in, too small to lie down in, too small to sit comfortably. Prisoners were crammed inside and left there, days sometimes, weeks, forced into a permanent crouch, muscles cramping, mind breaking, begging to be let out even if it meant the rack was waiting. The Little Ease still exists technically. Tourists walk past it on tower tours. Most don't even notice it. Just a small door in a stone wall. Nothing to indicate what happened inside. These devices were used on men and women alike. Rank didn't always protect you. Wealth didn't protect you. Even the cloth didn't protect you, if the crown wanted you badly enough. Anne Askew found that out in 1546. Anne was a gentlewoman from Lincolnshire, educated, articulate, deeply committed to the Protestant faith. She'd left an unhappy marriage and come to London, where she fell in with reformers who wanted to push the English Church further from Catholic tradition. This was dangerous. Henry VIII had broken with Rome, sure, but he wasn't fully Protestant either. He liked being head of the church, didn't much like people telling him what to believe. And by 1546, the king was old, sick, paranoid, and looking for heretics to burn. Anne was arrested that spring, accused of denying the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation. In other words, she didn't believe the communion bread actually became Christ's body. A theological dispute that shouldn't matter to anyone except priests and scholars. But in Tudor England, it could get you killed. They brought her to the Tower for questioning, and when questioning didn't work, they brought her to the rack. Anne Askew was one of the only women ever officially tortured in the Tower. The Lord Chancellor himself, Thomas Wriothesley, oversaw her interrogation. He wanted names, other Protestant sympathisers, ladies at court, maybe even the Queen, who might share Anne's beliefs. Anne wouldn't give them up. Not one name, not one hint. They stretched her on the rack until, by her own account, she was nigh dead. Her joints separated. Her body was so damaged that when they finally took her off, she couldn't walk, couldn't even stand. The official torturer, a man named Anthony Knivett, reportedly refused to keep turning the rollers at some point, said it was too much. Wriothesley himself had to take over the cranking. Think about that. A Lord Chancellor of England, one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, personally operating a torture device on a young woman because even the professional torturer thought it had gone too far. Anne still didn't talk. A month later they burned her at the stake. She had to be carried to the execution in a chair because her legs no longer worked. They chained her upright to the stake because she couldn't stand on her own. And when the flames rose around her, she reportedly never made a sound. Anne Askew's story was published after her death, smuggled out of England by Protestant sympathisers. It became a bestseller across Europe, proof of Catholic cruelty, propaganda for the Reformation. Her suffering wasn't meaningless, but it was still suffering. 60 years later, another prisoner faced the Tower's interrogators. his story would become even more famous. Guy Fawkes, November 5th, 1605, the Gunpowder Plot. A group of Catholic conspirators tried to blow up Parliament, kill King James III, and somehow spark a Catholic uprising that would restore their faith to power. It was never going to work. Too many people involved. Too many chances for leaks. Someone talked, and the whole thing unravelled. Fawkes was the one they caught in the cellar, guarding 36 barrels of gunpowder, enough explosive to level the entire building and everyone in it. King, lords, commons, all of them. When guards burst in at midnight, Fawkes was carrying a watch, slow matches, and touchwood. Everything he needed to light the fuse that would have changed English history forever. He gave a fake name at first, John Johnson, claimed to be a servant, said he didn't know anything about any plot. The guards didn't believe him. Neither did the king. King James himself took an interest in the interrogation. He wrote a letter authorizing torture with specific instructions. Start with the gentler tortures, he wrote, and if those didn't work, proceed by degrees to the worst. The phrase by degrees tells you everything. They weren't supposed to break him all at once. They were supposed to take their time. They took Fawkes to the tower. We don't know exactly what they did to him. The records are deliberately vague, but we can see the results. Before his torture, Fawkes signed his name with a clear, confident hand. The signature of a soldier, a man used to documents and authority. After several days in the tower's basement, he signed again. The second signature is barely legible, a shaky scrawl that looks like a child's first attempt at writing. His hands were so damaged, his body so broken, that he could barely hold the pen, could barely form letters. The transformation is visible in those two signatures, preserved in archives, showing exactly what the tower did to him. Fawkes confessed. Of course he confessed. Everyone confessed eventually. He gave up the names of his co-conspirators, the details of the plot, everything the government wanted to know. Then they executed him and his friends by hanging, drawing and quartering. The most brutal death the English legal system could devise. Fawkes got lucky, in a way. He was so weak from torture that when they hanged him, his neck broke immediately. He died before they could cut him down and butcher him alive. Small mercies. But not every story from the tower's dungeons ends in death. Some prisoners got out, a few even escaped. John Gerard was a Jesuit priest, a Catholic missionary operating secretly in Protestant England, knowing that capture meant death. The government hunted men like him relentlessly, said mass in hidden rooms, baptized children in secret, heard confessions from Catholics too scared to practice their faith openly. They caught him in 1594. Gerard was held in various prisons before ending up in the Tower in 1597. The authorities knew he was important, knew he had connections to the Catholic underground. They wanted names, safe houses, networks. They wanted to tear apart the entire secret church he'd helped build. So they hung him from the manacles. Gerard described it later in his autobiography, one of the few first-hand accounts of tower torture we have. They led him to a room with iron gauntlets hanging from a pillar, made him climb a stool, locked his wrists into the gauntlets, then kicked the stool away. He hung there for hours, his entire body weight suspended from his wrists, arms stretched above his head, feet dangling, barely brushing the ground. The pain was excruciating at first, then went beyond pain into something he couldn't even describe. His hands went numb, his vision blurred. He thought he was dying. They did this to him multiple times, brought him back, hung him up, waited for him to break. He never did. Never gave up a single name. Between torture sessions, Gerard was held in the Salt Tower, a round chamber with stone walls where prisoners had carved their names over the centuries. He could trace the marks of those who'd come before him, Catholics mostly, men who'd suffered in the same rooms, some of whom had died for the same faith. Gerard started planning his escape. He had allies outside, fellow Catholics who hadn't been caught. He communicated with them using invisible ink made from orange juice, wrote secret messages between the lines of innocent letters. When the paper was heated, the hidden words appeared. It was a trick he'd learned somewhere, probably from other priests who'd evaded capture. The plan was insane. Gerard was being held in the Salt Tower overlooking the moat. His friends would row a boat to the base of the wall after dark when the guards changed shifts and attention was lowest. They'd throw a rope up to his window. He'd tie it off, climb down, and escape across the water. The problems were obvious. Gerard's hands were ruined from the manacles. His fingers barely worked. He could hardly hold a spoon to feed himself, let alone grip a rope tight enough to support his weight. Climbing down would require strength he didn't have, and if anything went wrong, if a guard looked out a window at the wrong moment, if the rope broke, if the boat drifted too far, he'd either drown in the moat or be recaptured. Recapture meant the manacles again, the rack this time probably, and then execution. He practiced in his cell, tried to rebuild the muscles in his hands by squeezing whatever he could find, prepared himself mentally for what was coming, wrote goodbye letters, just in case. He did it anyway. On the night of October 5th, 1597, Gerard waited until full dark. His accomplices were somewhere below, invisible on the black water. The signal came, a low whistle, barely audible over the wind. Gerard crept to his window, wedged it open, trying not to make noise. Saw the faint shape of a boat below. 2 men huddled inside. They threw up a thin cord and Gerard caught it, pulled up the heavier rope attached to it, tied the rope around a cannon in his room, the heaviest anchor he could find, tested the knot twice. Then he climbed out onto the window ledge. 50 feet of empty air beneath him, cold water at the bottom, freedom or death, nothing in between. He started down. His hands gave out almost immediately. The damaged muscles couldn't grip. The rope burned through his palms. He wrapped his arms around it instead, hooking his elbows, sliding more than climbing. His sleeves tore. His skin tore. Blood made the rope slippery. Halfway down, he stopped. Couldn't go further. Couldn't go back. His arms were shaking so badly he could barely hold on. He hung there in the darkness, suspended between the tower wall and the water, and thought this was how he would die. But his friends had thought of this. They'd tied knots in the rope at intervals, places where he could hook his arms and rest. Gerard found one, caught his breath, kept going. The last 10 feet he basically fell, dropped into the boat hard enough to nearly capsize it. His friends grabbed him, steadied the vessel, and started rowing. Away from the tower, away from the torturers, into the night. John Gerard escaped the Tower of London, one of the very few prisoners ever to do so. He fled to the continent, lived another 40 years, and wrote his autobiography so that future generations would know what happened in those cells. He never named his accomplices, never revealed who had helped him. Even in safety, even decades later, he protected them. The tower kept torturing prisoners for another century or so. The practice gradually faded as England became more squeamish about such things. By the 1700s, the Rack and the Scavenger's Daughter were curiosities shown to tourists as relics of a barbaric past. But the rooms are still there, the stone walls that absorbed so many screams, the iron rings where chains once hung. If you take the tower tour today, you can see some of the old equipment, reproduction racks, restored manacles, information plaques explaining how everything worked. It all looks very educational now, very museum-like, safe. But late at night, when the tourists are gone and the ravens have settled, there are stories, guards who hear sounds from the basement, screams that can't be explained, cold spots that appear in rooms where prisoners once hung from the ceiling. Anne Askew might still be there, Guy Fawkes, all the nameless prisoners who broke on the rack and confessed to crimes real and imagined. The tower remembers. It always remembers. By the 1600s, the tower had settled into a kind of routine. Prisoners came in, some walked out, some were carried out in pieces. The ravens watched from the battlements. The guards did their rounds, business as usual, but every now and then something happened that nobody saw coming. In 1671, a man named Thomas Blood tried to steal the crown jewels, not just look at them, not just touch them, actually steal them. The crown, the orb, the sceptre, the physical symbols of English monarchy, kept under guard in the most secure fortress in the kingdom. And he almost got away with it. Blood was Irish, a former soldier, an adventurer, a man with a talent for schemes that range from ambitious to completely insane. He'd already tried to kidnap the Duke of Ormond and hang him at Tyburn. That attempt had failed, but Blood escaped punishment somehow. He always seemed to escape punishment. His plan for the jewels was elaborate. It started with reconnaissance. Blood disguised himself as a parson, a respectable clergyman just visiting London. He went to the tower as a tourist, paid his fee, and asked to see the crown jewels like any other curious visitor. The jewels were kept in a basement room called the Jewel House. An elderly man named Talbot Edwards was the keeper, living in an apartment above the vault with his family. Edwards was 77 years old. He'd held the position for years. He was proud of his jewels, happy to show them off, grateful for the tips that visitors left. Blood played the part perfectly. He was charming, pious, full of compliments for Edwards and his family. He came back several times, building a friendship with the old man, brought his wife along once. She pretended to feel faint, and Mrs. Edwards kindly invited her upstairs to rest. Now Blood knew the layout of the private apartments too. The final piece of his plan was a marriage proposal. Blood mentioned that he had a nephew, a fine young man with money, who was looking for a wife. Edwards had a daughter. Wouldn't it be lovely if the two young people could meet? Edwards was delighted. A wealthy husband for his daughter? What father wouldn't want that? They arranged a meeting. Blood would bring his nephew to the tower on the morning of May 9th, 1671. They would all have breakfast together, discuss the match, celebrate the happy occasion. Blood arrived early. He had 3 accomplices with him, all armed, none of them his nephew. He told Edwards that while they waited for the others, perhaps the old man could show his friends the crown jewels. They were so eager to see them. Edwards agreed, led the group down to the jewel house, unlocked the door, stepped inside. The moment they were in, Blood hit him with a mallet. The 77-year-old keeper went down hard. Blood's men stuffed a gag in his mouth, tied him up, threw a cloak over his head. Edward struggled, tried to shout, threw the gag. One of the thieves stabbed him with a short blade, not deep enough to kill, but deep enough to make the point. Then they went to work on the jewels. The plan was to hide everything under their cloaks, walk out of the tower like nothing had happened. But the crown jewels weren't designed for concealment. The orb was too bulky, the crown was too awkward, the sceptre was too long. Blood had solutions. He flattened the crown with his mallet, hammering the priceless gold into a shape that would fit under his coat. His accomplice shoved the orb down his breeches. For the sceptre, they tried to saw it in half. They were still sawing when everything fell apart. Edward's had a son, a soldier named Wythe, just returned from fighting in Flanders that very morning. He'd been away for years, finally back to see his family, walking through the tower gates with no idea what he was about to find. He arrived at his father's apartment, found it empty, called out. No answer. Strange. His father was always there, guarding the jewels, entertaining visitors. Where could he have gone? Wythe went downstairs looking for his father and walked straight into the jewel house. The scene must have frozen him for a second. His elderly father on the floor, bleeding, bound, a cloak over his head. 3 strangers with the crown jewels in their hands, the crown hammered flat, the sceptre half sawed. The orb stuffed down someone's trousers, then everyone moved at once. Treason, Wythe shouted. Murder, the crown is stolen. Blood and his men shoved past him, ran for the exit. A warder named Captain Beckman heard the shouting and gave chase. More guards joined. Suddenly it was a foot race through the tower, 3 thieves sprinting for freedom with the symbols of monarchy bouncing in their clothes. They almost made it. Got past the inner ward. Got through the first gate. Blood still had the flattened crown under his cloak. He could see the horses they'd hidden near the wharf. Just a few more yards. A guard tackled Blood at the final gate. The crown went flying, clattering across the cobblestones. The accomplice with the orb in his pants was grabbed a moment later. One man got away briefly, but was caught before he could reach a boat. The whole gang was captured, disarmed, and dragged off to face what should have been certain death. Old Talbot Edward survived his injuries somehow. 77 years old, stabbed and beaten, and he lived to tell the tale. His son was hailed as a hero. The crown jewels were recovered, a bit dented but intact. And blood. Blood should have been executed. Treason, assault, robbery. Any one of those charges could have meant the scaffold. Instead, something bizarre happened. Blood refused to talk to anyone except the king. Demanded a personal audience with Charles II, said he would only explain himself to the monarch directly. Any other prisoner would have been laughed at, then hanged. But Blood was interesting. Charles was curious. They met. What exactly was said, nobody recorded. But when the meeting ended, Blood wasn't just pardoned. He was given a pension, lands in Ireland, a place at court. The man who tried to steal the crown jewels became a friend of the king who owned them. Theories abound. Maybe Charles admired the audacity. Maybe Blood knew secrets that made him worth keeping alive. Maybe the whole thing was some kind of elaborate plot that the king had been in on from the start. Nobody knows. Blood took his secrets to the grave when he died in 1680. The crown was repaired. The orb was cleaned. The sceptre was never sawed in half after all. New security measures were installed, and the story of Colonel Blood became part of the tower's legend, proof that even the most secure fortress could be vulnerable to a man with enough nerve. The jewels Blood tried to steal weren't even the original crown jewels, by the way. Those had been destroyed decades earlier. During the English Civil War, Parliament had executed King Charles III and abolished the monarchy. They didn't need crowns and sceptres anymore. Symbols of royal tyranny, they called them. So they melted them down, sold the gold, pried out the gems and auctioned them off. Centuries of accumulated regalia, gone in a few months of revolutionary zeal. When Charles II came back in 1660 and the monarchy was restored, they had to make new jewels from scratch. The crown Blood flattened was only 11 years old at the time, brand new as these things go. The tower itself had played a role in the Civil War. When fighting broke out between King and Parliament in 1642, London sided with Parliament. The tower, sitting in the heart of London, became a parliamentary stronghold. They stored weapons there, held royalist prisoners, used it as a base for defending the city. Charles III had never got his tower back. He lost the war, lost his crown, and lost his head outside the banqueting house in 1649. His supporters were hunted down. Some of them ended up in the same tower cells where they'd once locked up parliamentary enemies. After the Restoration, Charles II took revenge. The men who'd signed his father's death warrant were tracked down wherever they'd fled. Some were caught in Europe. Others were dug up from their graves, their corpses hanged and beheaded posthumously. Oliver Cromwell, the Lord Protector who'd ruled England after Charles III's execution, got the worst of it. He died in 1658 and been buried in Westminster Abbey with full honours. 3 years later, his body was exhumed, dragged through London, hanged at Tyburn, and beheaded. His skull was stuck on a spike outside Westminster Hall, where it stayed for 25 years. When it finally blew down in a storm, the skull began a strange journey, passed from collector to collector, displayed in private museums, sold at auction. It wasn't returned to Cromwell's family for burial until 1960. 300 years of wandering for a dead man's head. The tower collected more prisoners as the century wore on, Jacobites mostly, supporters of the exiled Stuart kings who kept trying to reclaim the throne they'd lost. In 1715 and again in 1745, Scottish armies marched south behind Stuart pretenders. Both times they were crushed. Both times their leaders ended up in the tower. The Earl of Kilmarnock, the Earl of Cromarty, Lord Balmerino, Lord Lovat. Names that meant something in the Scottish Highlands, nothing in London. They waited in the tower while their trials dragged on, knowing how the story would end. Lord Lovat was the last of them, 80 years old in 1747. A wily old politician who'd switched sides so many times that even he probably lost track. He'd supported the Jacobite Rising of 1745, and when it failed, he couldn't talk his way out of it this time. They built his scaffold on Tower Hill. A huge crowd gathered, the biggest in years. Everyone wanted to see the old traitor get his head chopped off. They packed the streets, climbed on rooftops, filled a wooden grandstand that had been built for spectators. The grandstand collapsed. Too many people. The supports gave way, and dozens of spectators crashed to the ground. At least 12 died, maybe more, killed trying to watch someone else die. Lovat thought it was hilarious. From the scaffold he looked at the chaos and laughed. The more mischief, the better sport, he reportedly said. Then he laid his head on the block and died. The last person beheaded in England. After him, execution meant the rope. The tower kept evolving. Less a prison now, more of an armory and archive. The menagerie was still there. expanded over the centuries until it held lions, leopards, monkeys, an elephant or two. But by the 1830s, the zoo was becoming a problem. The animals were restless, the conditions were cruel, and sometimes things got dangerous. In 1830, a keeper was mauled by a leopard. A lion escaped its cage briefly. A monkey bit a soldier badly enough to cause a scandal. The Duke of Wellington, Constable of the Tower at the time, decided enough was enough. In 1835, the menagerie was closed for good. The animals were transferred to the New London Zoo in Regent's Park, where they'd have proper enclosures and professional keepers. The lion cages were torn down. The bear pit was filled in. After 6 centuries, the tower's collection of exotic beasts was finally gone. What remained was history and ghosts. The Victorians loved both. They were obsessed with the medieval past, romanticising an era that had been anything but romantic for the people living through it. They restored parts of the tower to a medieval appearance, tearing down later additions and rebuilding battlements that looked properly ancient. They opened new areas to tourists, printed guidebooks full of gruesome stories, trained the yeoman warders to give entertaining tours. Queen Victoria herself visited multiple times. She walked the same corridors where her Tudor ancestors had imprisoned their enemies, stood on Tower Green where the scaffolds had been erected, probably thought about how different her reign was, how civilized, how modern, and the Victorians spread the ghost stories, collected them like specimens, embellished them, published them in magazines and penny dreadfuls, made them part of the tower's official mythology. A guard in 1816 swore he saw a ghostly bear emerge from a doorway near the jewel house. It was late at night, and he was alone on patrol. The thing came out of nowhere, padding toward him in the darkness. He thrust his bayonet at the beast, but the blade passed straight through, hit the wooden door behind with a thunk. The bear vanished. The guard collapsed. He was found the next morning babbling about what he'd seen. Nobody believed him at first. Then he died a few days later. From shock, the doctors said. His heart just gave out. One of the old menagerie bears, come back from the dead. A hallucination brought on by too many lonely night shifts. Impossible to say. But it made the guidebooks, drew more tourists, became part of what people expected when they visited. Anne Boleyn walked the corridors at night, her head tucked under her arm. The princes drifted down staircases hand in hand, pale and silent, looking for someone to help them. Monks from the dissolved monastery processed silently through walls that hadn't existed in 300 years. Lady Jane Grey appeared on the anniversary of her death, a white figure glimpsed in a window and then gone. Margaret Pole fled forever from a spectral executioner, reenacting her botched death for eternity. Every year brought new sightings, guards who refused to patrol certain areas after dark, cleaners who felt invisible hands brush their shoulders, visitors who photographed empty rooms and found unexplained figures in the developed pictures. Real, imagined. Does it matter? The tower had earned its ghosts. 1,000 years of blood and betrayal left something behind, even if that something is just the weight of memory. By the late 1800s, the tower had become what it remains today, a museum, a monument, a place where tourists walk through the same gates that once swallowed queens and princes and walk out again, safe, unharmed, carrying souvenir keychains. The ravens still patrol the grounds, at least 6 of them, always, fed by dedicated keepers, their wings clipped just enough to keep them from leaving. The legend says that if the ravens ever abandon the tower, the kingdom will fall. Nobody believes it literally, but nobody's willing to take the chance. The 20th century was supposed to be different, modern, civilized, past all that medieval brutality. The Tower of London was a tourist attraction now, a place for school trips and family outings, not dungeons and executions. And then the wars came. World War I brought something nobody expected. German spies, captured in Britain, held in the Tower of London just like traitors, had been held for centuries. The ancient fortress was pressed back into service as a military prison. 11 men were executed there between 1914 and 1916, not by axe, not by rope, by firing squad. They were led out to the tower's inner grounds in the early morning darkness, tied to a chair, blindfolded, a target pinned over their hearts, then a volley of rifle fire, and it was over. The first was Karl-Hans Lodi, a German naval officer who'd been caught sending intelligence reports about the British fleet. He wrote coded messages about ship movements, troop deployments, anything that might help the German war effort. The British intercepted the letters, traced them back to Lodi, arrested him in Ireland where he was posing as an American tourist. He was shot on November 6, 1914. Reportedly calm to the end, shook hands with his guards, thanked them for treating him well during his imprisonment, refused to be tied to the chair at first, then accepted it when told it was regulation. The firing squad consisted of 8 soldiers from the Scots Guards. They lined up in the tower's miniature rifle range, an indoor shooting gallery normally used for target practice. Not the most dignified setting for an execution, but practical, contained, private. After the volley, the officer in charge walked forward and fired a single pistol shot into Lodi's head, just to make sure. Standard procedure. A doctor confirmed death. The body was buried within the tower grounds before most of London knew what had happened. 10 more followed over the next 2 years. Some were German, some were from neutral countries like the Netherlands or Peru, recruited by German intelligence with promises of money and adventure. All of them were caught. The British were better at counter-espionage than the Germans had expected. Their graves are still there, marked with simple stones in a corner of the tower grounds. Tourists walk past them without noticing most of the time. Just another patch of grass in a place full of history. Then came the Second War, and one more execution. Josef Jacobs was a German spy. Parachuted into England in January 1941, landed badly, broke his ankle on impact. He was lying in a field, in pain, unable to walk, when a farmer found him the next morning, still wearing his German uniform, still carrying his radio equipment. Not exactly a master of espionage. They brought him to the tower, tried him, sentenced him to death. On August 15th, 1941, Jacobs was taken to the tower's miniature rifle range. He couldn't stand because of his ankle, so they sat him in a chair, pinned the target over his heart. The firing squad raised their rifles. Joseph Jacobs was the last person ever executed at the Tower of London. 900 years of death, ending with a German spy in a wooden chair, unable to walk to his own execution. The chair is still there, by the way, kept in storage somewhere. Historians have examined it, counted the bullet holes, wondered what Jacobs was thinking in those final seconds. But the tower held one more prisoner during the war, and this one was famous. Rudolf Hess, Deputy Führer of Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler's right-hand man. In May 1941, Hess did something that nobody has ever fully explained. He climbed into a plane, flew to Scotland, parachuted out, and surrendered to a farmer. He said he'd come to negotiate peace, said he had a message for the British government, said a lot of things, actually, most of them contradictory. Was he a genuine peace envoy? A madman who'd snapped under pressure? A defector? Nobody knew then. Nobody knows now. The British brought him to London, and for 4 days they kept him in the Tower. Rudolf Hess, the last state prisoner of the Tower of London. He paced the same floors where Anne Boleyn had waited for death, looked out at the same walls that had held the princes, slept in rooms that had seen 1,000 years of captivity. Then they moved him to more conventional prisons. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, eventually dying in Spandau Prison in 1987 at 93 years old. The last prisoner of Spandau, just as he'd been the last prisoner of the Tower. The war left other marks on the Tower. German bombs fell during the Blitz of 1940 and 1941. Several buildings were damaged. The medieval chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where so many executed prisoners lay buried, had its roof blown off. Fire spread through parts of the complex. The crown jewels were secretly removed, hidden somewhere safe for the duration. Probably in the countryside, maybe underground, the exact location still classified. Nobody wanted to risk losing them to a German bomb, and the ravens nearly disappeared. By 1945, the Tower's famous birds had been reduced to a single survivor. The bombing had killed some. Others had flown away in panic and never returned. The ancient legend said that if the ravens ever left the Tower, the kingdom would fall. Winston Churchill was not a superstitious man, but he was a practical one, and he understood the power of symbols. The British people had just survived years of bombing, rationing and sacrifice. They didn't need their ancient fortress stripped of its iconic birds. Churchill ordered that new ravens be brought to the Tower immediately. The population was rebuilt, fed on a diet of raw meat and blood-soaked biscuits, given names and individual personalities by their keepers, treated in their way like minor celebrities. Today there are always at least 6 ravens at the Tower, usually 7 or 8. Their wings are clipped just enough to keep them from flying away, but they can still hop and flutter around the grounds. They're surprisingly large up close, bigger than most people expect, with thick black feathers and intelligent eyes that seem to watch everything. Tourists photograph them. Children try to pet them, which the ravens don't appreciate. The birds mostly look annoyed at all the attention, stalking around the grounds with the dignity of creatures who know they're important. Each raven has a name: Jubilee, Harris, Grip, Poppy, Georgie, Edgar, Rex. They have distinct personalities too. Some are friendly, some are grumpy, some are mischievous, known for stealing things from tourists or untying shoelaces with their beaks. They're cared for by a dedicated raven master, a yeoman warder whose entire job is keeping the birds healthy and happy. It's a real position. One of the stranger jobs in the British government. The current raven master lives in the Tower with his family, sharing space with the ghosts and the tourists and the birds he looks after. The legend says the kingdom will fall if the ravens leave. Nobody believes it literally, but the ravens stay anyway, just in case. Some traditions are worth keeping, even if you can't explain exactly why. After the war, the Tower settled into its final role. No more prisoners, no more executions, just history, preserved and polished for the millions of visitors who stream through every year. Well, almost no more prisoners. In 1952, a young gangster named Ronnie Cray was arrested for failing to report for national service. He'd been drafted into the army, didn't want to go, and the authorities eventually caught up with him. They held him in the tower for a few days before transferring him elsewhere. Ronnie and his twin brother Reggie would become the most infamous gangsters in British history. They ran organised crime in London's East End through the 1960s, built an empire on violence and intimidation, and eventually went to prison for murder. But for a brief moment in 1952, Ronnie Kray was a Tower of London prisoner, one of the very last, a footnote in the long history of people who passed through those gates and into captivity. The tower became a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1988. Official recognition of what everyone already knew. This place mattered. 900 years of history, concentrated in a few acres beside the Thames. Today about 3 million people visit every year. They come from everywhere. Japan, Brazil, Germany, Russia. Countries that were once enemies, now sending their tourists to gawk at the crown jewels and take selfies with the beefeaters. The crown jewels are the main attraction for most visitors, kept in a specially designed vault, displayed behind thick glass, protected by security systems that would make a bank jealous. People file past on a moving walkway, catching glimpses of crowns and sceptres that have been used to coronation ceremonies for centuries. The imperial state crown alone contains 2,868 diamonds, 223 pearls, 17 sapphires, 11 emeralds, and 5 rubies, including the Cullinan II diamond, one of the largest cut diamonds in the world. Tourists press their faces against the glass, trying to take it all in during the few seconds the walkway allows. Some visitors come for the armour. The White Tower houses one of the world's great collections of arms and armour, including suits worn by Henry VIII himself. You can see how his waistline expanded over the years, each new suit of armour a little wider than the last. A king's diet recorded in metal. Others come for the ghosts. The tower offers special after-hours tours, lantern-lit walks through the darkness where guides tell the old stories in hushed voices. People claim to feel things on these tours, cold spots, presences, the weight of history pressing down. The yeoman warders still guard the tower, still wear their Tudor-era uniforms, the red and gold that looks medieval but actually dates from the Victorian Restoration. They're all former military, required to have served at least 22 years with an honourable record. It's a prestigious position, an honour. About 500 people apply every time a spot opens up. They live inside the tower with their families, actual homes within the fortress walls, kids growing up surrounded by history, playing in courtyards where executions happened, doing homework in the shadow of the White Tower. Every night, the yeoman warders perform the ceremony of the keys, a ritual that's happened every single night for over 700 years, with only one brief interruption during the Blitz. At exactly 9:53 p.m, the chief warder emerges with the lantern and the tower keys. He walks to the outer gates, meets an escort of guards, and begins locking up the fortress, gate by gate, lock by lock. The same words spoken every night for centuries. Halt! Who comes there? The keys. Whose keys? King Charles's keys. Pass, King Charles's keys. All's well. The ritual takes about 7 minutes. Tourists can watch if they book ahead, standing in the darkness as history repeats itself one more time. When it's done, the tower is locked, sealed up for the night, just as it was in William the Conqueror's day. The guards patrol, the ravens sleep, and somewhere in the darkness, maybe, the ghosts walk. You can visit the tower yourself someday, if you haven't already. Walk through the gates that swallowed so many prisoners. Stand on Tower Green where the scaffolds were erected. Look up at the White Tower, the oldest part, the Norman keep that started it all. The stones are the same stones that William's workers laid in 1078, the same stones that saw Ranulph Flambard escape down his rope, the same stones that heard the princes crying in the night, the same stones that felt Anne Boleyn's blood soak into the earth. 900 years of stories, 900 years of people living and dying and hoping and fearing within those walls, kings and queens, traitors and saints, spies and thieves, children who never grew up, women who went to their deaths with more courage than the men who condemned them. The tower holds them all, holds their memories, holds their ghosts if you believe in such things, and every night, after the tourists leave, after the ceremony of the keys, after the gates are locked and the lights go down, the tower is quiet. The ravens settle on their perches. The Thames flows past in the darkness, the same river that carried Anne Boleyn to her doom, the same river that has carried 1,000,000 boats past these walls. Maybe the ghosts come out then. Maybe Anne walks the corridors touching her neck where the sword fell. Maybe the princes drift down the stairs, holding hands, looking for someone who never comes. Maybe Guy Fawkes rattles his chains in the basement, or Margaret Pole runs forever from a phantom axe. Or maybe the tower just settles into itself, stone and mortar, history and memory. 1,000 years of stories, sleeping until morning brings the tourist back again. You're safe tonight, warm in your bed, far from cold stone cells and executioners' blades. The tower is thousands of miles away, or maybe just across town, but either way it can't touch you. It's just a story now, just history, just the longest, bloodiest, strangest story that one building has ever contained. The ravens are sleeping, the guards are walking their rounds, the Thames is flowing past in the darkness, carrying the reflections of city lights on water that has flowed there since before London existed. William the Conqueror built his tower to inspire fear, and it worked for 900 years. But tonight, here, now, there's nothing to fear, just the weight of history, pressing gently down like a heavy blanket, just the knowledge that people endured, survived, sometimes even escaped. The tower remembers everything, and now, so do you. Let your eyes close. Let the story settle into your mind like sediment at the bottom of a river. The princes and the queens, the spies and the thieves, the escapes and the executions, all of it drifting down into dream. The tower will still be there in the morning. It's been there for 1,000 years. It's not going anywhere, but you can rest now. You can sleep. The ghosts keep their own watch tonight.